Well, namaste and welcome to everyone joining us today, the 26th of March, 2026. My name is Sanjay Kucheria, and on behalf of the Sanatan Dharma Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session. Through these conversations, we aim to explore Indian knowledge systems as lived frameworks that help us understand human behavior, emotion, and leadership. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. This session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A segment toward the end of the talk, and audience questions can be submitted using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom app and anytime during the session. Today's session, Shanta Rasa, Leadership and Rasa in Indian Psychology of Emotion, invites us to look at leadership and relationships through a lens that is rarely discussed in modern discourse, that of Rasa, or the experience of emotion. Contemporary frameworks often treat emotion as something to be managed or controlled. However, Indian traditions have long explored emotion as something to be understood, refined, and experienced deeply. The idea of rasa, especially shanta rasa, the state of inner stillness and equilibrium, offers a powerful way to think of leadership, presence, and decision making in complex environments. Today's conversation will help us explore how emotional depth, aesthetic experience, and inner balance shape individual well being along with the quality of leadership. It is an honor to have with us Dr. Shilpa Panditji. Shilpa ji is academically trained as a psychologist and a student of life. Currently, she teaches psychology at Ahmedabad University. Prior to that, she has been involved in teaching, research, and social action over the last 25 years. She's interested in rasa, music, dance, emotions, as well as the states of well being. She has worked within the domain of leadership, creativity, and well being in social contexts. She has authored three books and is currently working on a book manuscript on bhakti as the embodied and integral Indian psychology. Shilpa ji, thank you for being with us today. Shubh Ram Navami. We invite you now to take us through your presentation as I help us understand how the concept of ras and how our tradition sees emotion and leadership. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay ji. And I'm very glad to be here during the times that we are living in. The topic that we have becomes quite important. In these times for global audiences, all of us are trying to make sense of the changes that are happening in the world due to multiple reasons. And in that context, the idea of Shanta or peace, which is one of the signature concepts in Indian philosophy and lived Indian psychology, becomes very important. So let us see if how where this conversation takes us. And as it is about Shantarasa, it is going to take us towards a state of reflection at the very least, and probably a kind of a longer inquiry. As you said, the Indian psychology that we are uh, looking at is a lived tradition of more than 2000 years of time. There are changes in it, there are debates and discussions, cultural practices are part of it. Because we are talking in this globalized world with an enlightened audience, I would like to start with some basic understanding of the terms that I will be using. So, one of the terms that we use is bhava. Bhava is a Sanskrit technical term. It has a lot of meanings. One of the meanings is manifestation. But in the context of psychology, we think of bhava as an emotional state. We can also call it as a raw emotional state. And as we move forward, we will understand the distinction between raw and refined. Sometimes it is difficult to understand what is raw emotion and what is refined emotion, and we'll come to that. The second term which we use is rasa. Now, rasa is a is one of the most important concepts in the Indian philosophy as well as in Indian psychology, and it's particularly used in any kind of an appreciation of life. So when I was working as a psychologist in a large psychiatric hospital in Delhi, oftentimes people whom I met, I was interning there during my master's program long time back. Oftentimes, people whom I would meet would say to me in Hindi, which I will translate, they would say, Jivan mein ras nahi hai, which means that I have no appreciation left of life. Now, technically, so rasa is a concept not just used in aesthetics, but it generally talks about an existential appreciation of living processes without judging it, without judging them, or without saying whether it helps me or hurts me, or what is in it for me. So, rasa is that profound concept, and we'll talk about it later. Here, we are saying it's a flavor, appreciation, flavor when emotion is experienced as an existential emotion. That's the way we will define it for now. Now, the third concept is self recognition. So, the Indian philosophy and psychology says that when I experience the emotions as the existential flavor of life, then I recognize myself. And I don't mean myself as myself in this petty role or in this body which is going to die, but as self as consciousness. So the aspect of myself includes recognition, correct, appropriate recognition of all emotions as existential aspects of my being. So that is self recognition. So, this is what it means, direct experiential insight that my emotions are mine, but they are shared, they are human emotions. Rather, they are existential emotions as well. I mean, some non humans can also experience them in rudimentary forms. Then the concept that we will talk very briefly is called Nirveda. Nirveda is a concept or an argument that was put, which is a detachment from emotion, that I don't need to feel it. Sometimes, a lot of times, these young millennials say, I don't need to feel it. I can be I can be dissociated from it. Now, that's a very strong term, and I usually discuss it in the lived when we try to solve problems. Is distancing equal to dissociation? So this is one question that's why this term is important. Then the another term that we talk is nirodha, which is used in yoga, and this is basically having no fluctuations in emotions, right? So nirodha is the fluctuations that emotions have. So emotions are not only sometimes seen as opposite to reason, but they are also seen as constantly fluctuating and thereby disabling our decision making. So we will talk about it when we talk about the scenario. Now, in the Indian historical context, 9 rasas have been discussed, and I have listed them down here, and 9 bhavas, which are emotions, raw emotions, and then they are transformed into the rasas. Okay, so we have these 9, which are romance or shrungara, um, then fear, which is one of the core 9 emotions, anger, aversion, disgust, laughter, hasya, then grief, and then astonishment or awe. That is also one of the prime main emotions in the Navarasa framework. Then Veera or conquest or a warlike emotion of warrior-like emotion of enthusiasm. And finally, there is a 9th rasa, which is the topic of today's conversation, which is a signature concept of the Indian culture and psychology, which is Shanta, which is at peace. Generally described as peace, but we will see if we can understand it a bit more. Now, when this was to be explained, recall that, like we are like 2000 years uh, prior to today, there was no media, and there was no manuals to teach emotional intelligence, and there was no texts were limited, but you had to reach to a lot of people. And the idea of rasa bhava theory was in the process by which raw emotion gets transformed into a self aware, existential aware insight, right? So this is a step by step process, and as you can see, they use the stage and the dance drama format to teach about emotional awareness as self awareness. So, emotion is not to be regulated, not to be suppressed, not to be controlled, but something to be aware of as self awareness, as a core aspect of my being. So, how does this start, this process? So this process starts in the context of dance dramas, in the historical context. So we the question is, are emotions my enemy or are they my friends? So the idea here is that the emotion, because it's a part of myself, it is not distanced from myself, it is a part of myself. I cannot dissociate from an emotional experience of life. So how can I convert my own emotion as my friend? So emotion is a upaya, the word that we use in Hindi, Sanskrit, and several other Indian languages is upaya. So how do I convert emotion from my enemy to my friend? So what is the medium, or what is the modality or pedagogy of being able to see that? And that is stage. The stage is the projection of the human emotions being played out in the context of drama, but I am not in on the stage. I'm not playing the drama. I am watching it. And that means I can watch from a distance, but I'm engaged with it. So, what are the dance dramas that, Indian culture would frequently show? Many of them are epics like Mahabharata, like Ramayana, like so many of the stories, so many of those scripts. Those scripts have a dramatic element. There are protagonists and antagonists. There are emotions getting played out. And using that, I am able to have an engagement and yet maintain an optimum distance, and I can see what's happening without getting, note the word, entangled into it. So the fact that I can see while being engaged means that I have created an optimum distance, and that optimum distance gives me an insight. That's how bhava becomes rasa. If it is me, my emotion, my suffering, my profit, my loss, my desire, my status, then I cannot see. And therefore, rasa is when it is distilled inside. The moment it is distilled inside, I'm able to take self aware actions which are not self absorbed or narcissistic, which are looking at all of us as existential creatures, going through our sufferings and our pleasures and our achievements, and the non narcissistic understanding of it, which brings us to rasa as a flavors of life. Now, this is beyond the normal management and regulation approach. The standard approach says that you must manage. You somehow must do a balancing act. You must somehow do what is called as a regulation. So it means that I must, often in the worst case scenarios, it means that I must manipulate others so that they give an emotional reaction that is useful to me. This is a general standard approach, and the Indian approach, much like the Buddhist approach, which came from a similar kind of context, the Indian context focuses more than management and regulation on the understanding of emotion, and insight into emotion. And in the rasa theory, it is part of myself, my being. Emotion is part of my being, and I'm converting emotion generally as an enemy to my friend. To my friend, and to be a friend of everybody in my team, everybody in my family. Because recall, India is a collectivistic relational culture. Okay, so we talked about this alchemy of emotion. We defined the foundation, bhava and rasa. So, a short kind of a consolidation of what we have tried to understand. Then, bhava does have several meanings. For example, one of the meanings of bhava and bhava is Shiva himself. So, one of the signature iconography that we look at is the dancing Shiva, Nataraja. Because Nataraja in Sanskrit means the dance of life, right? So Shiva himself is dancing the dance of life, and all of us are watching that. Sometimes it is a dance of destruction, sometimes it's a dance of joy. So bhava bhava has very deep meanings, but for current context, this is a good enough meaning. Now, rasa is existential insight, which transforms this from me and mine to an existential experience. Okay, now there are 8 bhavas and 8 rasas. I said 9 because the ninth rasa was added after 1,000 years. The Shanta rasa was added after 1,000 years. Now, rasa is such a powerful, layered concept. So it just doesn't mean that I think everything is good. No. It has at least 3 layers, which I have written about in some academic journals. So it simultaneously operates at 3 levels. One is at the somatic body level. So in Ayurveda, we have the concept of rasa. And there also, the idea of transformation is underlined because Ayurvedic texts say that the mother's milk is rasa because it nourishes the young infant. And they had this question that how come a milk is produced by the mother where you can recognize all other fluids which are nothing like the milk, right? So at the somatic level, rasa exists in the Ayurvedic concepts, right? Then at the socio-emotional level, rasa exists in our relationships as emotions and the distilled insight from emotions. And at the meditative level, it exists, rasa as a signature concept, exists as an extraordinary meditative awareness. Now, all of us are interbeings, to use the phrase of a great Buddhist master. We are not, in the Indian context, we are not locked in the body. We are not locked in the mind. We are not split between mind and body. We are interbeings as somatic, socio-emotional, and meditative, and interbeings with all of us who are around us, right? So this simultaneity principle operates in the context of rasa. Now, in the context of Shanta, I just mentioned it. I'm going down back again just to summarize it. In the Vedic context, you see this referenced in one of the key Upanishads, this very important statement, Raso Vaisaha, which means the consciousness, the self, is filled with emotional well being, is filled with emotional insight, is a very sagacious, mature personhood that does not deny emotions, but that doesn't get entangled in emotions. So you see all the Indian iconographies, even of the great Buddha, with that beautiful emotional well-being presented in their being. Then you have Natya Shastra, which you see the timeline from, they say, from 200 BCE to 200 CE, where there is a theorization of the emotion in the texts. Then, after 1,000-year debate, there is a great Kashmiri master, Abhinav Gupta, who talks about rasa in his book Abhinav Bharati, and there he introduces Shantarasa. as a great transformative awareness, as a great existential awareness, right? So now what does it mean? What does it mean to say that you are at peace? Does it mean chup baithiye? Does it mean stay quiet? What does it mean to be peaceful? So it challenges our baseline assumptions of peace. So, general common translation, which you see in texts as well, is that of tranquility and peace. But there was a 1,000-year debate on it. What is it? What does it mean to experience peace? Does it mean that I negate all my emotions? Does it mean that I stop all my psychological processes? These were the two arguments, which one of which was yogic argument, which is nirodha, that I stop all my psychological processes, I sit in a samadhi state, then I don't need to worry about. I'm at peace. Yes, of course, it's one kind of peace. The other was that I do not have the emotional volatility. I do not feel things. There is a nihilism associated with it, that I negate everything as impermanent as well. So this was a Buddhist argument. But the Kashmiri masters rejected them philosophically, and I can share this paper. And they said that, in fact, it's a positive state. Shanta is a very positive state of self awareness where I can see the emotion as part of my existential self, as part of the self as consciousness. This was a positive statement which was given, which means that Shanta is that clear mirror which does not shatter my seeing. So I must clean my mirror. That is the process that we see, the transformation of bhava and rasa. I must allow myself to see all emotions, positive, negative, volatile, non-volatile, without negating them, without getting entangled in them, without getting shattered by the intensity. Now, this is a very powerful issue, and which brings me to, let's say, three scenarios that we will try to discuss for some time. So one is applying rasa. So one of the most interesting things that I have observed in the current context while I'm talking with people, even professionals, is this complete burnout. Okay, and this burnout is associated with depression in a very strange and a surreal manner. Today we were discussing that, can we even think without a computer? Can we even stay without accessing our digital gadgets? Is it even possible? That's a very strange question, right? So the question that historically people asked was, can intensity work and give me insight? So let's say somebody is deeply in love, or a mix of lust and love, and they have a breakdown of their relationship. They experience extraordinary depression. Will they be able to see insight? So on the surface, it seems, yeah, maybe, but there is a small bridge there, that because of which many people are not able to develop that insight. Many people go from one relationship to another. Many people go from one job to another. Many people continue with having this extraordinary burden on them. So now the answer that Indian psychologists said was, intensity by itself does not work. Right? Intensity by itself can shatter you. There is something more in that, and that is the ability to see, which comes from the Shantarasa. So, when there is depression or burnout, what is the experienced emotion? It is grief, extraordinary grief for oneself, for one's incapacity, perceived incapacity, inadequacy, perceived inadequacy, frustration. How does one process it? How can one manage it? How can one regulate it? So we are saying managing, regulating are like band-aids. We must be able to experience that in the clear mirror of the Shanta. And the clear mirror of Shanta, which means that I must be able to distance myself, not dissociate myself, to disentangle myself and say, look at this person. Look at this person. Why is she working so much? She, he, they. What is it that they would like for themselves at the core of their heart? Right? What is this drama all about? What is the drama telling at its existential level? The moment that Shanta Rasa flows in, there comes Karuna. Compassion, not just for oneself, but even for others, for everyone. And that compassion will then say, now that I have seen it in me and in others, how do I act? How do I act constructively? How do I act in a way that nourishes all of us? So the decision making is changed very briefly, right? Now, second context is conflict. Conflict is endemic in in current context and was has always been. It may have amplified now, maybe, but it has been there. How does one work with relational conflict? So there is an intensity of emotion. What is that intensity? Krodha. The bhava that we say is krodha, anger. So whenever there is relational conflict, should it always translate into aggression? Or is there a better way to manage conflict? Conflict will happen if we have two people within a person. Will be conflicts of what one wants and what one has, right? So how does one manage in this context relational conflict? So does managing and regulating work, or where does insight come? So managing and regulating work, but they work at an incremental level, and they may generate dysfunctional and functional mix of outcomes depending on how good you are at managing and regulating, right? But what is the radical insight? The radical existential insight is to literally observe the power of fury. And I think currently, when we see Shiva Nataraja, we are in awe of that extraordinary dance that Nataraja is doing, right? Whether it is the destruction dance or it is the dance of joy and happiness and fertility and abundance and prosperity, we can only look at that dance and be in complete awe. So, what is that extraordinary power of fury? And what is that extraordinary consequence of fury? The consequences of my emotions, I can recognize them only when I have that pause. And that pause is that clear mirror that Shantarasa affords us. And in that, I can see the power of my anger and its consequences, the power of others' anger and their consequences, and at a very slightly higher meditative awareness, see others' compulsions as well, because they may or may not have that pause. While I, as a leader, have the privilege of that pause, a psychological privilege. I can clean my mirror, I can have that silence and process things carefully. Now, I can use my anger strategically, productively, and not automatically. Otherwise, relational conflict and the intensity of the raw emotion generates um, a mindless, for a lack of better word, a mindless conversion, automatic conversion of anger into aggression. Now, anger, does it always need to be translated into aggression? What are the other ways in which I can use my difficult emotions, for lack of better word, difficult to process emotions? So the third scenario that we have is that the other side of it, which currently is experienced by a lot of people, which is alienation. And a distance which is not required, which is not optimum. Okay. So, this is something that we struggle in families these days. We are not able to talk with each other, or because we are using different contents or we consume, that's the term, we consume different contents, we are making different meanings. And when we are making different meanings, we are not understanding each other, and there's a distancing which is not optimum that is occurring in the families, in our relationships, and in a whole in all other contexts. And fundamentally, the work from home context gave this insight to us that we have to now over communicate to even get the basic things right. Right? There's too much of disembodied work, distance doesn't help. It doesn't give us peace. So, what is the shok? What is the bhava? What is the experience one feels in alienation? It's a similar kind of a grief, but it is an angry, sometimes it's an angry grief, or it's a mix of anger and grief. Now, what is the insight? The insight also is karuna, but what is the constructive action? The constructive action here is, and I will go back to that idea of, work from home and work from in an embodied in-person context, because human brains, minds, and beings are integrated. It's an integrative Indian psychology. It integrates body, mind, spirituality, and the social context, all of it together, including the environmental context. So, now, what would be the constructive action in this? Constructive actions would be embodied actions, embodied and active actions. And I will go to the Indian music scenario. In the Indian music scenario, there is an embodied and active dialogue between the musicians and the audiences. The audiences don't feel discourteous or rude to say, wow, 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 kya baat hai, very nice, bahut badhiya. In Hindi, these are terms of appreciation, right? Or even during dance, the audiences feel free enough to have a kind of a dialogue. It's not a direct verbal dialogue, but it's an inactive dialogue. And there's a neuroscience logic to it through the use of our mirror neurons. So there is, that would be a constructive action. So the action will come to the through the micro context, and that will come, which will be fitting, accurate, because of the Shanta Rasa. Now comes a larger community or collective context. And in the collective context, we have group conflicts. We have group conflicts or miscommunications often in our work environment. Sometimes they are also in, if there are what is called as joint family networks, large families, there are group conflicts. So, how does one convert the difficult emotions into something which is productive, into something which is a friend of yours? So, in the Indian context, emotions are also sometimes seen as enemies, right? Shad Ripu. But the Rasa framework says, can you convert them into friends? Because they are aspects of yourself. So, what is the existential insight here? The rasa is Veera rasa. Bhaya, you convert it to a Veera rasa. And where is the pause? The pause is looking at the purpose. So, we have leadership frameworks in contemporary psychology. We have a framework called a transactional leader versus a transformational leader. So, what's the difference between a transactional leader and a transformational leader? A transformational leader must be able to observe with an optimum distance. And that is stillness. That is stillness, right? And that alone brings dharma. So, dharma here is not religion, dharma is the coherence, looking at everything, all actions to be taken together. That is dharma. And that allows a refocus and an appropriate action that can be taken. So therapists must use it, coaches must use it, and leaders also must be able to do it. We use training, supervision training in counseling and clinical. One of the things that we teach by not using rasa framework but almost intuitively is the ability to see, right? Okay, so what is this self recognition that we've been talking about? And I said I gave one definition, a simpler one. Now I'm using the spiral curriculum. And we say, what is this self recognition? In practice, it means that I do not over identify with it, with myself in it. And I do not completely be apathetic to it. And I maintain an optimum self recognition, and that self recognition is the true peace that we will have. Why? Because if we were to sit in samadhi, we will not be able to act. And we must act in this world is so important for us to live. It is an existential joy to be in this world. So we cannot negate this world. We cannot even say that emotions are impermanent. No, we can't, because every emotion, even in that impermanence, will have consequences. For now, at least, it will have consequences, right? So what is the core thesis of this theory? Is this self recognition, and I have tried to explain this self recognition. Then what is the key point? That Indian psychologies are not esoteric philosophies, and we don't need to philosophize them. And there are living embodied practices even now, such as aesthetic practices. So what do we in people in India do? Often they do everyday art, and this everyday art is not to be kept in a museum. This everyday art, the purpose of this everyday art, as I have discussed it in one of my books, is not to make it permanent, eternal piece to be watched, although even that gives moments of insight. But this everyday art is for myself. It must express myself. It must allow me to be, it must allow the canvas to be the mirror to me. So there are then ways to understand the mirror, right? So if I'm painting, then the painting process and the canvas allows me to reflect. If I'm singing, then singing, the process of singing, musing over it, allows me the reflective space to ask questions. But I must sing, or I must play the instrument, or I must paint. Though both action and the reflection will go together in the rasa theory. So it's not negation, it's not stopping of all psychological processes, stopping of all thought as we see in Nirveda and Nirodha. It is rasa. Okay. Finally, it must move from from a narcissistic, self-absorbed perspective. The shift is to the distance. What does distance do? The shift is from a self-absorbed perspective to an existential experience where the person needs to take the right action. The right action is an important feature of this. And that is Shanta Rasa. Now, how did I go about it? Very briefly, I have used this research movement in my work. I have done empirical work with musicians, dancers, and painters. And that is how I was able to understand the texts, because the texts are in very difficult to understand sometimes, because the context of the texts, one wonders, is it the same or not? And in what way is it different? And so on. And then creating some kind of a principle, deriving some kind of a principle, and then checking it back with the empirical work. And my empirical work is largely with creative artists, musicians, painters, dancers, as well as with leaders, because the idea that as a psychologist I hold is that of peace. Now there is cultural neuroscience is quite trending, and you will see that in the biosocial, the brain itself is biosocial. It has plasticity that will allow the cultural aspects to be embedded in the brain functioning. A lot of research is there on it. Then we have debates on affective neuroscience. But the extraordinary point here is, theoretical point is, that there is no concept of peace as a distinct affective experience in the contemporary mainstream Western psychology, because they do not, they haven't framed it even in their philosophies. Peace, shanti, shanta. Whereas we have that in our frameworks, but currently, as a developing country, we do not have the instrumentation to see what's happening in the brain when it is quiet and happy. Just quiet, not doing anything, not engaging with the computers, not looking at the notifications, not even meditating. Or if meditating, still people are working on meditation, but just sitting quietly. क्या कर रहे हैं हम? What are we doing? Right? And finally, in specifically in music theory, there are some very interesting questions on raga. We have a strong in Indian context, in Indian philosophy, we have a very strong music theory that certain note patterns create a certain emotional response. That's a great theoretical question to be tested empirically, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done on this. So I will close finally with this quotation from the great Kashmiri Shaiva tradition, which is the heart of this rasa theory, which says, the quotation, and I'll translate it, says, Nartaka Atma, the dancer is the self, which is the self of all, which is that dancing Shiva. Ranga Antaratma, the stage, is my inner self and I am seeing. So it's a non dual perspective. The dancer is the self of all, the seer is the self, and the stage also is the self. So, with this, I will close here and I really look forward to your questions, whatever they might be. I really look forward to them.
Thank you, Shilpa ji. That was pretty insightful, very deep, very engaging uh, presentation. You
Thank you.
offered as a way to think of emotion as something that can shape awareness, that can allow presence, and allow us to expand our leadership uh, capacity and capability. We'll now open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please type it in the chat box, and please let us know where you're joining us from. And while we're waiting for audience questions, I'll start by posing my first question to you, I guess I should say. You you talked about in the scenarios, one area you talked about Shanta Rasa as providing an optimum distance from emotion. How
Yes.
can leaders and individuals cultivate this distance between being fully engaged and not being overwhelmed, particularly in these fast-paced environments? So, how do you cross that chasm? I guess is my
Mm.
question.
Yes. So I think thank you for this question. And once again, I really feel grateful for this opportunity here. So first point as a opening note is that we tend to think of leadership only in certain contexts. But anyone who's able to be in a state of stillness and insight is a leader. Anyone. So it means that leadership is in corporate context, correct? But leadership is in sports context, correct? But leadership is in all relational contexts. And leadership also is in the context of, if one can imagine oneself as staying alone, as in ekanta, right? Now, what are the what are the ways to bridge that? And that's why, I found this idea very strange in the afternoon when we were discussing that, can we even think without someone outsourcing thinking for us, without outsourcing our thinking to someone? 25 years back, people would think by themselves and they would write. So there are several ways which we need to be very customizing towards the person, because different people have different pathways, different ways in which they recognize the stillness in them. Some people recognize the stillness in them when they are moving, paradoxically. And so you will find several leaders saying, then when I go for my morning jog, or when I go for my evening jog after my work, I suddenly find that I am quiet. So sometimes, very paradoxically, uh, body moving, mind becomes quiet. So some people will do very well. Depends. Indian psychology works on the person. So these are general principles. So some leaders will do very well according to their adhikara if their bodies are active but their minds are quiet. Some people, some leaders, or some persons are very it works very well when they express their emotions in writing. So what happens then, that the blank page works as a mirror, right? Third, some persons are able to have insights while they are doing an aesthetic activity. So the aesthetic activities which need to be embodied, so which need not be only imaginary. So aesthetic activity could be, as I mentioned, painting, drawing, music, for example. Even some people would be able to attain that stillness while listening to music. Although I think production or practicing of music is quite a different, interesting way to look at Shantarasa, right? And finally, I think whenever people come to a mastery, then their minds become quiet. So whenever we are not in a master of something, we have to use our resources to process the things. But when we are masters of the game, then our actions are spontaneous, flexible, and we are aware of everything. So we have not zoned out in the sense that we are not distanced from everything. Rather, we become flexible in our actions so that they become appropriate actions. So these are the 4 5 things that I can think of. One is the body aspect, which we actually try to address in hatha yoga. Then the mind or the mental aspect, which we try to understand through pranayam practices, right? Then the aesthetic activities, which give us the mirror, which includes writing, right? And in the context, now I'm translating, this is my view, not the textual view, that if we are unable to find a clear mirror, then the therapist acts as our mirror. But if you have great friends, if you have great advisors, then talking to the correct advisors. So we recall that I said clear mirrors are important. One of the difficulties with leaders is that because there are people who will praise you and will not become clear mirrors to you, you may or may not get the correct advice. So, if you are unable to find a clear mirror in yourself, which is some pauses and meditative processes, these are the relational aspects where the whole world acts as a mirror if you clear the mirror, if the mirror is clean. Because the advice that others will give depends on how clean the mirror is, right? Now, if you are not dependent on all of this, then you must finally create a pause in you, which is the meditative process. Now, leaders may say, I don't have time. So, reflective leaders will find that time. But if they really do not have time, then these 6 or 7 things that I just mentioned will act as a clear mirror, will still you, or you as in any leader will still me, and then allow me to take the correct decisions.
That's gives a lot to work with, actually, and which I guess brings me to this to my to the next question.
Yes.
Uh, we so leaders and parents will rely on authority to
Mhm.
manage situations,
Yeah.
um, and particularly in contexts where you're dealing with a child or an individual who may not have the same level of develop the same level of awareness, for instance.
Yeah.
Um, from the person exercising authority, how can you shift using this theory, this rasa theory, and shanta rasa? How can you shift
Yeah.
the typical conversation, which is do as I tell you to do,
Yeah.
don't question me, etc., etc. Or, this is the direction we are going in, let's all go.
Yeah.
Um, how do
That's such
you,
an amazing question. Sorry. Yeah, there was a
yeah,
lag.
so how do you handle that?
Oh, I think that's such an amazing question because we tend to think that power, because these are some of the words that we use: power, hierarchy, and authority, right? Research across, even in the mainstream psychology framework, shows that there is a difference between an appropriate use of authority and an authoritarian or a dictatorial use of authority. There is a difference between an appropriate use of authority and an dictatorial use of authority. I can share a small story, right, which will tell this paradoxical dilemma that particularly teenagers and parents both have, parents of teenage children or sometimes even young adults. So there is this child, and this child has to decide on their careers, and this child told, every time the parents tried to help or shape or really try to facilitate career related decision making, the teenager obviously would say, obviously in the sense that the lifespan stages of rebellion, would say, you don't tell me what to do, I'll figure out what to do. Right? And this was in the context of whether you want to take science or arts or humanities in India, right? And the parents in this case were actually trying to say, take humanities, going by the non-conventional norm. But the child in this case wanted to show their brains, so to say, and chose to do science in 11th and 12th. And the child, 11th is very difficult in the Indian educational system, and the child failed in 11th class. And then the child turned around and said, why did you not tell me? So the parents said, well, we told you, you were not ready to listen. So the child said, but you should have insisted. You're my parents. This is the exact point about the use of authority. So, one of the things that we worry about and for which we need to pause, exactly pause at this point, that if I'm using my authority, am I using my authority? Is there a sense of narcissism creeping into my use of authority? Exercising authority is a sign of leadership at all levels. And there is no way we can live without authority. That's not going to happen, because there can be an authority coming out of knowledge. There can be an authority coming out of age. There can be an authority coming out of position. And authority is required to take people. The rightful use or the optimum use of authority is required. So, one of the ways in which I would request, this is still very general, I'm very specific and customized, but in this larger audience, one of the ways I would request the parents is to say upfront that, as someone who has had a variety of experiences, I will likely use my authority, but I will not impose or oppress my authority onto you. You have to be able to, I hope you are appreciating, even if I try to shape it in ways that you cannot understand now. Maybe that's one way to go about it. So, acting as a mirror sometimes for young adults, particularly, would be important because that idea of authority also changes by the age. When one is younger, in pubertal age, versus when the child is an adolescent, versus when the child is a young adult, versus when the child is a middle aged adult. Really, the idea of what is respectful exercise of authority changes. And that will come when you have a meditative pause, right?
So, yeah.
Again, the distance will be maintained, unentangled distance, but correct engagement. So there's no apathetic disenchantment, cynicism that happens. Why is that sometimes people feel cynical about it? People feel cynical when because they are not able to process the complexity within themselves. So I think there is reason to feel that it can go beyond cynicism or disenchantment.
So it brings us to this next question, and I guess it kind of goes together, perhaps I should say. So, what are the best practices for a child, for a couple or a parent and a child to be respectful to each other without hurting each other's feelings? And yeah, this is from Moscow. Question from Moscow.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for a teenagers for a teenager or a child, the methods are more activity oriented. Hmm? So one has to have shared activities because children learn by doing. So when there are shared activities, then we have in psychology what are called as teachable moments. Even in music, you have moments of surprise, like, oh, what was that? It was unplanned. So when one is working and exercising authority with a child, where you cannot talk big concepts because the child may not be able to understand, then with children, there are more activities which are to be required, which are placed in such a way that they allow us for a shared pause. There should be a shared pause. For example, a child and a father goes out in the night and sees the stars, and then they talk about the galaxy. That is a teachable moment. In that teachable moment, receptivity for the child is higher because the child is quiet. See, this is Shantarasa. The child is quiet, receptivity is higher, you are quiet, or any parent is quiet, and their ability to be optimum use of authority is also maximum. At that moment, when both of them are quiet, by this activity, learning will take place. That is Shanta. That is Shantarasa.
So, so in effect, if a parent or a boss leader were to engage with their children or with their employees and create an environment where they are able to where he's able to exercise authority without being coming across as being dictatorial and facing
Mm,
resistance and so on,
yeah.
then shared activity is one
One,
way that
at
I'm
least for
hearing from
children.
you that
Yes.
really makes it possible, and therefore,
Yeah.
and I would agree with that in the sense that particularly with children, when you have those shared activities, there's a certain level of and where the parent is also engaged, of course, that there
Yeah.
is a certain level of communication that happens, which is not which happens almost automatically or which happens very transparently
Hmm.
with the child, where you are
Yes.
then able to bring those other elements that you want to talk about without it
Yes.
being threatening or without being dominating in any way,
Yes.
being
Yes.
respectful in some ways.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
so now let me flip that around because that I want to get to the question as well, which is what do you do when when the other party, whether it's a child or an employee, doesn't quite respond to that? How do you create an environment where they start feeling that level of conception, that level of self-awareness, so that
Yes.
it creates a space for then you to engage with them much more deeply.
Yes. So that's a great question because it's a long-term question. So it has two different contexts. If it's the context of a workplace, then leaders typically will use a lot of daily activities to build that connection with their employees. I have seen leaders, CEOs, who will go and have lunch or have a cup of coffee and chat because that glue is required, or that non-threatening space, as you said, or that non performative space, or that non appraisal space, because employees constantly worry that they are being appraised. So they're constantly either self censoring themselves, or they are not showing themselves up at all, emotionally, I mean. So when you have non appraisal, non performative spaces, there is a kind of a glue or a bond that allows quiet peace, respect with each other at a human existential level. Then that dialogue will happen, right? In the context of children, or in the context of families, which are long term groups, families as groups continue to move for 40, 50, 60 years, right from birth to death. In that context, creating certain embodied activities, like, like I'm talking about ritual in a secular context as well, like certain rituals, like will create those spaces in at homes, in those shared activities, and so on. So for long term groups, the strategy is different. For a corporate or a business group, the person also has an option to not show up emotionally, right? Person can censor their feelings, whereas in long term groups, you will end up showing your emotions either way. So long term group strategy would be very different. The long term requirement for creating that base of peace and acceptance and love is quite different than in the context of a corporate group, where love is not required. Respect is required, care is required, but love and affection is not a requirement in that context, right?
No.
So that's the way I would like to answer your question briefly.
Thank you, Shilpaji. I know we've gone a little bit over time. Appreciate you bringing such clarity, such depth to the subject. This session reminds us that beyond action and decision making,
Yeah,
leadership is about inner balance, and leadership in the also in the context as that of a parent is
yeah,
about inner balance, emotional maturity, and presence. So I
yeah.
think as leaders and parents, we have to create that with ourselves first before we can ask of anybody else around us. So on behalf of the Sanatan Dharma Group, we are grateful for your time and insights. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. A recording of this call will be available within the next 48 hours, I should say. We look forward to continuing our exploration and learning with all of you. Namaste.
Namaste.